on their book, Voices for Transgender Equality, Making Change in the Networked, I can't speak today, public sphere. This event is hosted by the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. I am the Program and Communications Coordinator, because if you want to make your own title, you can. Great, right? So we have Corbin here, who's our Executive Director, in case anybody wants to talk to Corbin. She's fantastic. We're all fantastic. It's great. CTAP is dedicated to understanding the growing impact of the internet, social media, and other forms of digital information in the context of the people who design, use, and govern them. We are especially interested in people, platforms, and power. And if you want to look at the other themes that we actually have right behind on that little table there, we have some bookmarks that on one side, it has the themes that we've researched, what we're interested in. Power is going to be in big letters because that is what we use. Yeah, Alice is showing it off. That is what we use a lot. And then on the other side, it tells you about like who we are, what we research, anything. So if you want to take that, tell all your friends about us, we'd love that. And then we also have some copies of TJ's book that if you want to grab that on your way out, feel free. We have that for you guys attending. So thank you for being here. So today we are honored to host Dr. TJ Billard, Assistant Professor in the School of Communication at Northwestern University. And to introduce our speaker, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Daniel Kreis, who is the one of the CTAP founding principal investigators and the Edgar Thomas Cato Distinguished Professor here at Hussman.
Hey all, can everybody hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome turnout. Thank you all for being here. It's my great honor to introduce TJ for their talk on their remarkable new book, Voices for Transgender Equality. Dr. Billard received a BA from the School of Media and Public Affairs at GW and a PhD from the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California. In addition to their research, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, as part of their research, TJ also helped establish the Trans Equality Archive, the single largest collection of transgender political history in the United States. So it truly is an honor to have you with us today. It's also an honor that TJ's monumental new book is published in my co-edited Oxford University Press Unbound series with Nikki Usher-Laser. And I say that in part because we got to watch this book develop over the span of 2 years into the beautiful and powerful work that it is. Both aesthetically, it's gorgeous, and powerful in the set of arguments that it advances. And I just want to say a few words about where I see the book and why I've been so moved and excited about this project. First of all, this work could not be more urgent. At a time of backlash to the struggle for equality, across intersecting lines of race and gender, class and sexuality and religion, TJ's work offers a path forward. The book is brilliant in showing us the limits of mass media-centric activism that has long delegitimated trans people, trans voices, trans struggles, and trans ideals. What TJ shows us is that trans activism needs a holistic approach, activism that works across local and community media, interpersonal media, and yes, mass media. In short, being everywhere, what TJ calls a politics of flows that shapes dynamics of communication and builds and wields power to advance the cause of equality and equity. TJ is an academic, but one who bridges their research and activism. This is, I think, particularly an inspiration for me and something that we all emulate here at the center. Their transgender rights activism sits alongside their scholarly inquiries. The two are inseparable. As it should be, there's a great push in universities today, including our own, to pursue value-free scholarship, to both sides' political issues, to value civility above justice, and to value solidarity above equality. At best, this produces scholarship that's blind to power. At worst, it legitimates and defends a status quo that has systematically denied some people and groups their political and social rights, including their very right to exist. TJ offers us a model of what research can and should, to my eyes, look like if we see scholarship that is committed to democracy and human rights and dignity for all of us. TJ.
Okay. In the meantime, hello everyone, and thank you all so much for being here. A kind thank you to everyone at CTAP for allowing me to be here, to Dan for the characteristically overly kind introduction, and of course to Felicity for helping make all of this run. It is always a great honor anytime people want to invite you to talk about yourself for an hour and a half for the captive audience, but it's an especially wonderful opportunity to be here in a room with so many people who have very significantly shaped who I am as a scholar and the way that I work. So with that, just a small note before I begin the talk. While this lecture aims to kind of illustratively summarize the research presented in the book, there are various points at which more information on the topics that I am discussing can be found in journal articles or chapters or various things that I've authored elsewhere that are based on the same data as the book. And in those cases, a small QR code will appear in the corner and you can just scan that and save those things for later reading. So please feel free to do that. I won't be offended if you're taking out your phone while I'm talking. Cool. So transgender rights may seem to the general public like they've emerged into the mainstream of politics pretty much overnight. But for the trans activists who have been fighting tirelessly for even modest recognition for their civil and human rights, it has felt like anything but instant. During the hopeful, albeit slightly less transformative than initially dreamed, administration of Barack Obama, transgender rights activists made significant gains in federal and to a lesser extent, state recognition for transgender rights. The National Center for Transgender Equality, which was responsible for many of those victories and which I will be talking about at great length today, tallied over 160 federal policy changes protecting trans people and their rights between 2008 and 2016. And these policies were not the result of a particularly sympathetic or pro-trans administration, but the culmination of really a half century of slow, tiresome, and often quite agitated activism that secured a place for transgender rights as a central plank of the Democratic Party. Thank you. But in 2016, things began to turn. While the transgender rights progress made during the Obama era had been made relatively quietly, trans people were nonetheless thrust into the center stage of national politics with the spread of Republican-sponsored bathroom bills in various states that mobilized fears in large part about trans women's use of women's public facilities in order to legalize discrimination of various forms against trans people. The most notable of these bills, I regret to say, was the Public Facilities Privacy and Security Act, or HB2, here in North Carolina. And HB2 required people to use the restroom that was appropriate to the gender listed on an individual's birth certificate, regardless of any changes that may have been made to that birth certificate even during time. And was very quickly met with a rapid backlash and displays of allyship that really the movement hasn't seen since. Major corporations like Target, athletic groups like the NCAA, and even other state governments were protesting and boycotting the state, leading to economic losses estimated in the billions. The governor who advocated for and signed this legislation, Pat McCrory, lost his re-election bid in the aftermath of the HB2 blowback, and the law was partially repealed. But in 2016, things began to turn. HB2 and its fallout, and the fallout kind of alienated a lot of Republicans even, who thought that targeting trans people was a strategically, if not an ethically, dubious decision. Then presidential candidate Donald Trump, sorry, multiple names on multiple slides. Donald Trump even went on record around the controversy saying that he would gladly let transgender reality star and Olympian Caitlyn Jenner use the women's restroom in Trump Tower in New York. And this made it all the more surprising when only 6 months later, after his largely unexpected election to the US presidency, he announced a new policy targeting trans people on his favorite platform, Twitter. Thank you. So on July 26th of 2017, I was in the temporary office space that the National Center for Transgender Equality, or NCTE, was occupying in between successive office moves between their old offices down the street to their new offices down on K Street, the famous lobbying corridor in DC, and I was chatting away with then communications director Eric Dyson when Trump took to Twitter. In a series of 3 short, poorly capitalized tweets, he announced that he was banning transgender service members from the US Armed Forces, a move that, regardless of your opinion on militaries, was designed to basically set a legal precedent for discrimination in federal employment and would expel 15,000 transgender people from their jobs. Within mere moments, NCTE's phones began to ring, and one of the longest and most tiring days of my fieldwork was off to a banner start. On this particular day, I was about halfway through my first of 2 rounds of ethnographic fieldwork at NCTE, which the political scientist Anthony Nouns describes as the dean of transgender rights organizations. Across 2017 and 2018, I conducted a combined 10 months of participant observation at NCTE, primarily focusing on the communication or comms and outreach and education or O&E teams, which together coordinated all of the organization's communicative activities, and the members of those teams are listed here. I participated in and observed a variety of meetings. That's mostly what happens in organizations: strategy meetings, planning meetings, team meetings, campaign meetings, coalition meetings, interviews with journalists, protest rallies, media trainings, you name it, I was there. And in addition to participating in and observing this work, I also interviewed each of the members of the comms and O&E teams twice and conducted additional interviews with select members of the policy team who worked closely with comms and O&E. And then finally, one of the more interesting parts of my research, I conducted interviews with members of NCTE's Voices for Trans Equality, sparkling noise where I said the title of the book, or VTE, and Families for Trans Equality, or FTE, projects who did important communications work for the organization. Because together, these 2 programs established a national network of nearly 1,000 community storytellers, as they were called inside the organization, who received media and communications training from NCTE to make them effective spokespersons. And they were frequently deployed, as staff at NCT said, for a variety of purposes, ranging from testifying before state legislatures to writing op-eds to serving as sources in various news stories for different outlets across the country, and even just doing basic things like being more effective at pushing for change in their local school district. And it was on the basis of these data, these observations and interviews, that I arrived at the argument for this book. And the argument that I lay out in this first chapter of the book, like 90% of which is very handily available on the Google Books preview if you don't feel like carrying that book home. This argument builds on lines of scholarship across the fields of communication, sociology, and political science that are focused on media activism, social movement organizing, digital politics, and the network public sphere. As I argue, the rise of the contemporary transgender rights movement has occurred at a very particular time in the development of the media system, and the contours of the movement have been shaped by this new media environment in really important ways. The rise in salience of trans issues in recent decades has been secured less through increasing representation in mass media, although that representation has increased, and more through an apparent omnipresence of trans people across the various media and communication streams that kind of inform people's experience of the social world in daily life. Whereas activists of an earlier era could quite easily fight for representation on 4 broadcast television networks and a handful of national newspapers with confidence that success meant that your issues are being experienced by the vast majority of the population, activists today don't have those same assurances. And so obviously all of the theories that we developed to try to explain media power for social movements then don't really necessarily help us as much as they need to. Well, thank goodness that scholars have re-theorized digitally native social movements. Yes, except the field has largely traded a quite myopic focus on mass media for a kind of equally myopic focus on social media in theorizing activist efforts to make change through media and communication. Social media are largely considered to be the media of activism, the media through which movements organize themselves, represent themselves to the public, and make claims on the state and other institutions that are invested with social, cultural, economic, and political power. But the transgender movement isn't a hashtag movement, and it isn't a networked protest movement, and it isn't even a digitally enabled movement. It is very much an old school classic social movement in every sense that just happens to be native to the digital environment. And the same is true of a lot of the most important social movements today, but our theories don't necessarily reflect that, largely because it's cool and fun and new to just talk about the social media. And this is especially clear when we consider the role of organizations in social movements, where scholars attempting to grapple with the changes that digital technology have brought to social movements have typically fallen into two broad camps. And in one camp are what I call organizational transformationalists, who have focused on things like how political organizations use digital media to enhance their organizational capacities, to communicate with stakeholders, to mobilize participants, and so on. But these scholars tend to ignore the wider public in a focus on the relationship between organizations and their predefined constituencies. But on the other camp, we have what I call grassroots enthusiasts, who have focused almost exclusively on how the affordances of digital technologies allow grassroots or otherwise decentralized activist movements like the Movement for Black Lives and Me Too to organize without organizations, to increase the visibility of their causes outside of the mass media, and to push, with questionable variable success, for certain movements for the visibility of their causes. And so these scholars tend to ignore the streams of communication in society that exist beyond our experience of digital media, except to construct those streams of communication as this kind of monolithic other that is the old media against which new media are being defined. And the problem with that is that the public communication infrastructure is now far more complicated than this argument suggests. And as this image shows, I promise it makes sense eventually if you look at it long enough. Just like magic eye your eyes on it and it'll come clear. Important sources of political information fall outside of our old and new media distinctions and often even span the boundaries between them. As the media sociologist Sandra Ball-Rakich outlined in her communication infrastructure theory, people are embedded in complex storytelling systems that span macro, micro, and meso levels. And in the networked public sphere, each of these is being experienced simultaneously in physical and in digital space. At the macro level sit mass media, or those media that have this kind of imagined audience of the entire nation. Are owned by large media corporations, whether those are for-profit or nonprofit, and they attract very large audiences. At the meso level, we have our local and community media, which have an imagined audience of some subnational population that's defined by geography or social identity or lived experience. And these media also generally attract smaller audiences, where they have quite a large drop-off between the smallest mass media and our largest local or community media. And then finally, at the micro level is where social networks connect people with family, friends, colleagues, community members, casual acquaintances, and others with whom they discuss issues of personal and collective concern. And these social networks include both the close bonds of people who live their daily lives together offline, and the also often looser bonds of people who are connected only through digital media. And so through these various sources of political information, which this mess of arrows is indicating are all interconnected with one another, the various flows of information, perspectives, and opinions form the public sphere in which individuals and communities engage in public debate, form public opinion, and at least theoretically influence the state. And this map of the network public sphere begins to hint a bit at why achieving change has required pioneering new approaches to activism, as seen in the work that was done at NCTE. These new approaches to media activism are the focus of Voices for Transgender Equality, and the book's core argument, as Dan helpfully previewed for me, is that contemporary activism is no longer structured around achieving visibility in mass media because they've been decentered as the primary avenue for the flows of political information, but neither is it structured around social media visibility. Rather, contemporary activism takes a more holistic approach to activism that seeks influence across the communication system that includes all of these various media. And on top of that, as I argue, the chimerizing influence of digital technologies, the way they fuse the logics, contexts, and practices of different media, requires that all of these are managed concurrently. In essence, the system-wide management that is necessary to make change requires that you maintain influence over the flows of political information about transgender issues and identities in order to improve the socio-political standing of the trans community. And this is a really tall order for small, short-staffed, overworked social movement organizations like NCTE. It's one thing if you are a massive organization like the ACLU, where you have not just probably one media relations manager, but probably multiple, if you're lucky, that works with journalists at major newspapers and broadcast outlets to get that kind of sympathetic coverage. But it's another thing entirely to have a small communications team that works to saturate a diverse ecology of print and digital outlets of various sizes and scopes all the way across the country, as well as trying to influence private conversations. And to do so when all of those things are influencing one another. But this is what NCTE did on the day of Trump's military ban and on every other day that I spent with them. They navigated, to use a stupid metaphor, the complex game of whack-a-mole that's being created by the contemporary communication system, in which failing to control the messages in any one domain means you're leaving open the others to influence that might derail your activism. You basically need to hit all of the moles at once and then just like hold them down and smother them. And so in this book, sorry, that was violent. I use the phrase "a politics of flows" to describe this general approach to activism that is developed to manage these complex and often unpredictable exchanges of political information, and in doing so, to make change in the network public sphere. And so my book builds this argument across 6 chapters that take apart and deeply analyze the communication system's constituent parts and the forms of activism that NCTE developed to influence each of them. Along the way, I introduce a number of novel analytic concepts that I hope will be useful to scholars across the study of media technology and social movements. But for the remainder of this talk, I want to focus on 2 specific cases that I recount in the book. The day of Trump's military ban, which I've already begun to tease, that was in the summer of 2017. And then the launch of the Won't Be Erased campaign in the autumn of 2018, both of which represent significant cases of antagonism from the Trump administration that required fast and flexible activism across the breadth of the communication system. And in doing so, I'll introduce a kind of selection of the concepts I developed that weave throughout the chapter. So we left off with the phones ringing at NCTE mere moments after Trump announced his ban on transgender service numbers by tweet, the first and likely last time that executive policy was set by Twitter, if only because it's called X now. But for about 20 minutes, then comms director Eric and the comms staff took frantic calls from reporters looking for comments and interviews. NCTE staff darted from office to office trying to figure out what it is they should be doing. And Mara Kiesling, executive director of NCTE, eventually called everyone into the conference room to set up a centralized war room from which staff would coordinate communications with journalists, policymakers, coalition partners, and trans community members around a shared strategy. The immediate priority was a press release, which the war room started to jointly draft as we ignored the still ringing phones. The president positioned this in terms of military readiness. Trans people hurt readiness. So in our statement and in interviews, we need to focus on military readiness and the harm throwing trans people out does, declared Harper-Jean Tobin, the director of policy at NCTE. There are 15,000 trans people in the US military, and we need to focus on what throwing out 15,000 qualified service members does. And let's not make this about Don't Ask, Don't Tell Part 2. That won't help anything, even though that's how journalists will want to paint it. This isn't Don't Ask, Don't Tell, Rafi Friedman-Gerspan, the director of external relations, quipped. This is just don't serve. Yeah, I like that, Mara rehearsed. This is not Don't Ask, Don't Tell. This is don't serve, don't serve. You can debate the quality of that tagline, whatever. Everyone quickly jotted down that brainstormed phrase to use in the press release. And Eric, the comms director, and communications manager, Jay Wu, huddled to craft the final wording before immediately posting it to the website and emailing it to NCTE's press list. This is worse than Don't Ask, Don't Tell. This is don't serve, don't serve. This is an appalling attack on our service members. It is about bigotry rather than military readiness, reason, or science. It is indefensible and cannot stand. The president wants to discard thousands of trained and skilled troops who are already serving honorably and done nothing but be honest about who they are. To turn away qualified recruits simply because of who they are is a shameful way to show our country's gratitude to the people who serve our country. It hit all the beats that you expect from a movement organization looking to be quoted as the counter perspective to an institutional actor. There's indignation, there's a general reference to the illegality of discrimination, there's a comment on the political consequences of the policy decision, and there's an appeal to a general ethos of American patriotism. But in a media environment in which journalists were just as likely, if not more likely, to pick up a source quote from Twitter as from an official press release, I looked directly at Shannon, NCT also posted this statement to Twitter. But the version, or rather versions of it that were posted there were different. In contrast to the analytic, albeit still emotional, tone of the official press release, NCT's tweets made more boldly emotive claims, such as using the lives, the careers, and the service of #transgender troops as a political wedge is disgusting. The emotive tone of the tweets was intended to encourage individuals, and in particular the hyperactive political hobbyists on Twitter, to share NCT's tweets by retweeting them, because we know emotionally charged content gets shared far more than analytic content. And NCTE was also keenly aware that journalists' perceptions of what issues were newsworthy were shaped by Twitter, ensuring a statement that is primed for circulation among Twitter politicos increased its odds of journalists thinking of it as something that mattered to talk about. And this constituted a kind of digital facelift given to certain traditional tactics of media relations, one of many that NCTE implemented on a regular basis during my time in the field. Over the rest of the morning, the team prepped Mara and NCTE's other media principals for a series of broadcast television and the occasional high-profile enough radio or print interview, Reuters TV, MSNBC, CBS, Fox, and so on. And in one interview I accompanied Mara for with a journalist from CBS News, she quipped that Trump's decision on transgender troops was dilettante policymaking by whim and tweet. Which I frequently quote because it's such a good quip. Other news outlets were frequently given statements from NCTE staff. Instead of Mara, NCTE had standing relationships with many of these journalists because they regularly covered trans topics, like Katie Steinmetz at Time, who did the famous trans tipping point cover story in Time magazine, Dominic Holden at BuzzFeed, and Nico Lang at Grindr's then newly launched but now defunct Into. And others NCT had never worked with before. And the journalists sometimes didn't know anything about the organization other than that having transgender and equality in the title made it sound like they were probably a good place to go for a quote. And so an intern at SiriusXM, for example, called to get a quote for Tim Farley's radio show, but didn't know who she wanted the quote from because she didn't know who was at the organization. And policy director Harper Jean was offered up for an impromptu 12-minute live interview with Tim seconds after the phone rang. At midday, though, we changed tack. NCTE at that point had worked with most of the major news outlets and even some unanticipated outlets like the magazines Elle, Harper's Bazaar, and Vanity Fair. As Mara declared in her parting shot before heading out of the office to NBC's studios, we need to make sure that trans voices are being heard on this. As staff repeatedly told me, knowing about a transgender veteran who lives in your county is far more important than knowing in general that there are trans people in the military. So staff switched to getting the voices of transgender service members and other transgender citizens into major press outlets, as well as local and community media outlets. So Jay and Digital Media Relations Manager Jason Errol worked with the Director of External Relations, Rafi, and Education Program Director Rebecca to connect news outlets from across the country with local trans people, the community storytellers I referenced before, from VTE and FTE. And these projects mobilized these members to do a lot of things in general. Contact their political representatives, connect them with local reporters, get their stories placed, and so on. And the VTE project had several veterans on the roll, including frequent collaborators like retired Army Colonel Sherry Sokolsky, retired Army Major Evan Young, and Air Force veteran Cynthia DeVille, pictured here. Staff connected these VTE veterans with major media outlets to humanize, the gross word, but what's what people said, the transgender service members who were being coarsely discussed in stories about Trump's tweets. In one case, I actually worked with the journalist Maddie Kahn at Elle to secure this interview with Cynthia DeVille that took the form of a confessional style video titled "A Trans Air Force Veteran Responds to Trump's Ban." And these stories re-centered the transgender service members in question and focused on the material impacts of Trump's proposed policy. Most VTE veterans, though, were connected with local media outlets where they lived. And the value of local media for NCTE was intimately tied to what I call its placefulness. And by that, I mean the strategic value of placing storytellers in local media was the specificity of locating trans people within a social world that was based in geography. For example, the Wisconsin State Journal ran a series of articles focusing on VTE storytellers with histories of military service whom NCTE connected with the publication. And two of those storytellers were featured as the centerpieces of news articles that clearly articulated the consequences that the ban would have on their lives. And significantly, both storytellers were positioned throughout their stories in relation to their Wisconsin geography. So Army Master Erica Stoltz, for example, was referred to as a Sun Prairie resident and a La Crosse native. Likewise, retired Army Colonel Sherry Swakowski was referred to as Sherry Swakowski of DeForest and as a Manitowoc native in an article that was titled, very clearly for my point, "Trump ban on transgender military service hits home for some in Wisconsin." Beyond factors such as religious affiliation, class, current employment sector, any of which could help people identify with the storytellers, geography became the basis for members of the public to identify with trans people when they otherwise wouldn't. NCT similarly worked to place VTE storytellers with histories of military service in media that served particular identity communities, like media serving Black American audiences or LGBTQ+ audiences. And the value of this community media, as I call it for descriptive ease, was in contrast intimately tied to its placelessness, which is that the strategic value of placing storytellers in community media was the universality of locating trans people in a social world that was based in collectively held but fundamentally imagined identities. In both cases, however, trans people were brought into social proximity, literal or figurative, with people. And these stories made Trump's proposed ban not just a policy decision regarding a culturally remote, marginalized group, but a grave decision with material impacts close to home. He is targeting people like us, even though trans people are not presumed to be like others. And over the following days, staff continued to connect VTE and FTE network members with various outlets, mass, local community, and to push stories out over NCT's social media accounts to encourage trans people on NCT's contact lists to make their voices heard in their communities and so on. Of course, the panicked flurry of communications returned to a routine churn, and within a few days, the news cycle mostly blew over, probably because Trump did something else. And still, conversations continued over social media and in communities as the implications of Trump's tweets were deliberated and stories of countless trans veterans and service members were heard, shared, and reshared. Well over a year later, crisis struck once more. Crisis was constantly striking in between, don't get it twisted, but like crisis struck once more that I'm going to talk about. Early on the morning of Sunday, October 21st, 2018, the New York Times published a report detailing the contents of a leaked memo from the Trump administration's Department of Health and Human Services. The memo was, per the Times reporting, part of an effort to establish a legal definition of sex under Title IX. Were such a memo to become policy, transgender people would, as put in the original headline of the article, be defined out of existence. Media relations manager Jillian Brandstetter raised the alarm as soon as the Times article was published that Sunday. By time NCT staff began to wake and look at their phones, Jillian woke up every morning to run several miles very early. They looked to their phones to find this panicked email. She'd already begun drafting a statement. Executive Director Mara called her shortly thereafter, consulted with Jillian on an angle, and by 10:30 a.m., a finalized press release was sent to journalists. Like most press releases, it began with a comment deriding the cruelty and political ineptitude of the leaked memo, the kind of comment that news articles would quote as this oppositional perspective. But halfway through, it shifted and introduced the language of erasure. No rule, no administration can erase the experiences of transgender people and our families. The release was no longer speaking to the media or in response to the Trump administration. It spoke directly to the trans community. To transgender people, I know you are frightened. I know you are horrified to see your existence treated in such an inhumane and flippant manner. What this administration is trying to do is an abomination, a reckless attack on your life and mine. But this administration is also staffed by inexperienced amateurs overplaying their hand by taking extreme positions that ignore law, medicine, and basic human decency. If they are hoping we will give up, they should reconsider the power of our persistence and our fury. Half an hour later, it was adapted and posted to Twitter, where it was retweeted thousands of times, but without the "won't be erased" hashtag that would go on to define the ensuing campaign. By the end of the day, the hashtag was in use around the office and sat at the top of a Google Doc that then Deputy Comms Director Jay Wu had created to be shared with coalition partners and with VTE and FTE members, containing messaging guidance, stock social media graphics for organizations to put their own colors and logos on, and a guide for individuals to hold their own in-person "won't be erased" rallies. After distributing and drafting the press release, Mara convened staff to plan steps for a sustained campaign for fear of letting yet another world-ending crisis for trans people slip off the public agenda within a day. The comms team decided that a hashtag would promote a sense of collectivity and increase public awareness about the mounting resistance. Drawing on the language of the statement that Jillian and Mara had drafted, digital media manager Laurel Powell suggested the hashtag "won't be erased." And the social media portion of the campaign would center on the message of "I'm trans, I'm here, you can't redefine me out of existence," a sentiment quite aptly captured by the hashtag. NCT would encourage trans people to post selfies using the hashtag as a symbolic act of counter-invisibility, and it would also provide social media graphics for people who didn't want to post themselves but wanted to be expressing solidarity. And it was decided that NCT would send out an email to its entire list, all like tens of thousands of people, including all the VTE and the FT network members, with the mobilizing portions of the statement, as well as all of the resources they were creating. The other main portion of the campaign would consist of a protest rally outside of the White House. That's what you do when you're in DC, you show up outside the White House. After the call was concluded and they had time to design the graphics, Jay sent an email out to all of the staff directing them to attend the protest rally the next day, and directed us, "Hey staff, this is now part of your job, post a selfie with a hashtag." Within a few hours, several staff had complied. Each of their selfies received hundreds of reactions and inspired responses from other trans people and their allies posting their own images, setting off this first wave of the "Won't Be Erased" social media campaign. And over the course of the day, thousands of individuals, many of them seeded by the VT and FTE members that NCT had gotten to participate, shared their selfies and posts using NCTE's graphics and hashtag. And by the end of the day, allied organizations like the Leadership Conference on Human and Civil Rights, the American Civil Liberties Union, and Planned Parenthood Action Fund, among others, released their own hashtags, their own statements using the hashtag as its organizing principle, but declaring their own allyship with trans people, each of which received thousands, if not tens of thousands, of retweets. And by that point, news articles were beginning to come out about this mounting semi-organic or seemingly organic resistance about NCT's fight with the Trump administration. And several were, as Executive Director Mara put it, basically promoting the rally. So the next morning, I arrived at NCTE to staff excitedly chattering about the fact that the newest New York Times article on the Trump administration's memo and trans people's response to it was credited NCTE with the "Won't Be Erased" hashtag, and it even included the hashtag in the headline. They also celebrated that the Times was not doing that whole "both sides" nonsense, as staff put it. And there were no quotes from hate groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which was not very common. It seemed like there was like an office quota for the number of times each needed to be referenced. Jay wondered aloud if the story was front page above the fold. I joked that there's no fold on the computer screen, but we did make sure to get a physical copy, and it was in fact above the fold. Probably a first for the organization. And later that day, NCT held its rally outside of the White House, filled with all of the VTE and FTE network members who were within driving distance and any allies who were mobilized by the now viral Facebook event invite. I got to hold the iPhone that live streamed the rally on Facebook. My arms did in fact get very tired. But that live stream was viewed over 200,000 times and shared thousands and thousands of times. So by the next day, NCTE alone had been featured in almost 600 news articles around the world, not including broadcast media. And highlights of those included the New York Times, MSNBC, Associated Press, Reuters, a New York Magazine feature that included the Twitter post by Jay and Laurel that kicked off the hashtag campaign, and a Slate article that featured a 19-year-old non-binary teen who had attended the preceding day's rally and who did not have a disclosed relationship to NCTE, but had in fact been part of the network. VTE and FTE network members across the country, inspired by the campaign and supplied with all of the resources that NCTE gave them, images, but also a rally kit. You could literally, out of the box, just host your own rally, meant that protests were being held in state capitals and major urban centers across the country. And inspired by this apparent groundswell of invisibly NCTE-led resistance, a number of celebrities, including Amy Poehler, Ilana Glazer, Abby Jacobson, Amy Schumer, Laura Linney, Sarah Ramirez, and several others contacted NCTE and worked with them to roll out a series of selfie-style videos standing up in support of trans people, which they posted to their own profiles using the hashtag won't be erased, of course. And importantly, the social networking strategy wasn't centralized in the ways that organizations' mass media work was, but it also resisted being decentralized in the ways that scholars have typically thought of networked movements and social media-based activism. NCT's work could best be characterized as a centralized decentralization. It was centralized to the extent that NCTE was responsible for providing the knowledge, skills, and resources that were required for storytellers, and on this occasion, celebrities, to navigate their own interpersonal publics in ways that advance the movement's aims, all while remaining invisible themselves in the process. But it was also decentralized to the extent that NCTE had no control over what people said or did with those resources, and it very much did not want to. It could not, resource-wise, accommodate that degree of control. And so NCTE consciously worked to create a self-mobilizing network that gave them and their messages reach into interpersonal networks across the nation in a way that appeared organic rather than coordinated, in which they could not have done centrally by themselves. And so in short, NCT's Won't Be Erased campaign effected social change by empowering trans individuals and allies to impactfully communicate their subjectivities online and in their local communities. And beyond affecting the discourses of social media or influencing the attitudes and opinions of the individuals and institutions that they worked with on a daily basis, NCT used these social networks to create a digital news event where the very fact of the resistance that was happening became itself part of the story. And so NCT was able to successfully seize control over the political information environment and set the terms of debate on transgender rights in ways that are still seen today. If you read news articles about attacks on trans people, it is very likely you will see the word erased somewhere in that story. A little homework for you if you want to do that. Okay, this will make sense in a second. I live in Chicago, Illinois, where every year the Plumbers Union Local 130 pumps a mysterious orange powder into the Chicago River to magically dye it a brilliant green in celebration of St. Patrick's Day. Over the course of a couple days, the green color fades as new water from Lake Michigan enters the river and as green water flows down into the Blue Des Plaines River. The process is safe and clean, we think, giving the city a short burst of unnatural color to mark an otherwise quite unremarkable holiday. It may sound, that's not an insult, but like it's just white people getting drunk, right? Anyways, it may sound strange, but this image of the river being dyed and the green slowly fading as flows of water dilute the color into nothingness almost perfectly matches how I envision the process of activism in the networked public sphere. If we revisit my map of the networked public sphere, we can see these three domains of mass media, local and community media, and social networks that comprise the contemporary communication system. They're connected and conjoined by streams of communicative flow. And if we imagine the messages that flow in the system as water, we can think of activism as the depositing of dye. When activists attempt to shape one domain of the communication system, they drop dye in it. That dye colors the waters pooled in that domain, and as water flows from one domain to the others, that water carries some of that color with it. But if activists drop dye in only one domain, then as that water circulates, the color becomes diluted enough that it ceases to be visible. If, however, activists drop dye in all three domains, then the color doesn't dilute, or at least not nearly as quickly. And instead, that colored water kind of circulates from domain to domain where it can be seen by all. And if you adequately understand the currents that are flowing in that system, you can be strategic about when and where you drop that dye to maximize its circulation. Metaphor over, I promise. This approach to activism represents what I call a politics of flows. And this kind of activism is focused less on affecting individual media types, media narratives, or media producers, and more on transforming how information flows throughout the communication system, shifting the locus of action away from targets towards processes. And this necessarily transforms what the repertoires of action are, as well as the kinds of resources that are required by social movement organizations to succeed at making social and political change. And the cases represented in my book each illustrate this in different ways. And as I observed while I was at NCTE, other social movement organizations have transformed their activism in the same way that NCTE did, both in the wider LGBTQ+ movement with organizations like GLAAD, in the reproductive rights movement with organizations like the National Network of Abortion Funds, and ironically in the anti-trans movement, where NCT often found themselves up against opponents like the Alliance Defending Freedom, who were using the exact same strategies as them. So, what now? Where do I go from here? Well, at the start of this lecture, I mentioned that in his tweets dismissing 15,000 trans service members from the US Armed Forces, Donald Trump justified his decision by claiming that providing transition-related care on public or to service members was too expensive. And similar claims about cost burdens of providing transition-related care on public and private health systems have been mobilized to support bans on providing that care, usually for trans youth. Well, I would personally argue that something being not cost-effective is not a reason not to do it. Put a pin in that. It also isn't true that transition-related healthcare is a cost burden. The actual cost to provide all members transition-related care equates to 22 cents per month per member for military-provided health insurance, and between 1.6 and 6 cents per month per member for private insurance. Trump's policy decision and the policy decisions of so many since then were justified, if not motivated, by outright disinformation. And indeed, misinformation is in many ways the defining feature of public debate on transgender rights, not only in the US, but also in the United Kingdom, which has earned itself the not-so-loving nickname of TERF Island, a reference to so-called trans-exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs, a coalition of cisgender women who are violently opposed to trans rights. And so given the undeniable centrality of mis and disinformation in transgender politics, my next book project, which I am already hard at work on, thanks to some generous grant support from the William T. Grant Foundation, builds on a lot of the research that I did in this book to analyze the central role that mis and disinformation play in anti-trans movements, political strategies in the US and the UK, why these strategies work, and what it is that we can do to curb its influence on policy and public opinion. So look out for working title, Cis-Informed Disinformation and the Media War on Transgender Rights, hopefully out in a couple of years. And with that, thank you so much for your attention. Thank you. And also, if you would like to buy the book, despite the fact it's being provided free to you here, but I have an obligation to do this, tell your friends, you can buy the book with a 30% discount with the ever so catchy discount code of ASFLYQ6, which I did not pick. But yes.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Alice Marwick. I'm a principal at CTAP at the Center for State Communication. TJ, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. So I want to start with the current project and then
Yes.
move into the next project. So it really struck me when you're relating these sort of anecdotes and these thick descriptions of things that happened during your field work, just how chaotic
Yes.
this process seems to the people participating in it. And that chaos really characterized a lot of politics during the Trump
Yeah.
era. How much do you think that chaos was due to Trump's desire to make policy by whim and tweet? And how much of it do you think is due to this sort of chimeric media system which you outlined?
I think that there's a bit of a balance there. I think that there's certainly a degree to which some of it was Trump driven, right? For example, the military ban wasn't a surprise to the generals of the DoD. They literally said when first contacted by journalists and they're like finding these articles, it's quite upsetting, but also amusing for them to be like, we're gonna have to get back to you. We didn't know this was happening.
Yeah.
And so certain features of that are certainly Trump specific, but there are other things that I think that even the nature of the working relationship with journalists, what the temporal expectations are on which they will be available and able to respond, and the fact that basically if you're not there when the first hit happens and you're not included in that first articulation of the story, you're fighting upstream to try to get any say over it. And so the number of times that I have sections of my field notes, despite the fact that this was a 9 to 5 office downtown DC, Monday to Friday, that I have field notes Saturday at 9:30 p.m. because there was a conference call because something happened. A lot of times those weren't necessarily about stuff. They were about something happening locally in a state somewhere. But the expectation of the pace at which conversation will happen meant that activists couldn't avoid doing that, where they risk kind of losing the reins on what the conversation looked like.
Yeah, and the ability to sort of shape that.
Yeah.
From the beginning. So, we have a lot of students in the room today, which is great. And as your kind of complicated graph shows, this is all, not only is this very fast paced, it's very complicated. And as you point out, it's really different from a lot of our theories and also some of our best practices that were developed before our current era. So what skills do you think students who are interested in a career, specifically in advocacy communication, working at a place like the institution where you did field work, what do you think they would need to have to do that, or what should they prioritize?
I think this is a very good and very difficult question to answer. I think, to be honest, I think that if you were to ask a lot of the people who I was studying at the time, if they were doing a good job, they'd be like, I never know. And there were a lot of times, in fact, since the book has come out, that some of them have read the book and reached out to me and they're like, honestly, reading it back, it makes it sound like we just were like so much smarter than we felt like we were at the time. That we were like doing so many things with such clear intention and we were kind of just panicked going based on what gut we thought made sense, but like we didn't know what we were doing was going to work. And so I do think that there is a certain degree to which the reason they were good at what they did was because they have, in a sense, a very good, like almost ethnographic understanding of the culture of media. A lot of them were coming from really different arenas. Jillian had been a journalist before she was their media relations manager. Jay had been a press secretary for, I want to say Health and Human Services, so in the government before they joined. Laurel had worked on political campaigns. And so all of them like had their component pieces where they just really understood the culture of what was expected of their domain of the media system. And there was a lot of intergroup trust among them that meant that they deferred to one another and their respective kind of cultural competencies in those areas. And they were constantly finding ways, okay, how can I maximize what you're trying to do with what I'm trying to do at the same time? And so a lot of this is heavily driven by creating a team culture that works as a single machine, but that also really just has an, not intuitive because it's not just based on random intuition, but like a developed palette for what it is that's necessary. And so I think that that's something that's like harder to get in, like it's not the kind of thing you'll necessarily get at like an internship, right? Where this is the way that we format press releases and things like that, right? Like that is something that is a deeper cultural understanding that if I do think that like actually learning academics in school is sometimes useful because we do have that like analytic lens on you know, taking the machine apart and understanding why it functions. And, you know, I think that, that's something that seemed indispensable to their effectiveness.
Yeah, like how do journalists judge something newsworthy? How do you create an event that gets press attention?
Yeah.
Like those kinds of things.
Exactly, yeah.
So I want to turn to sort of your next project, and we've done some work at CTAP on anti-trans disinfo as well, and something I care deeply about. And one of the things that struck me so much in your talk, you know, you have these 1,000 community storytellers. You have these people who have these stories to tell. The stories are being circulated. To what extent? A lot of the time, I think when we think about disinformation or misinformation, we think about like an incorrect fact that's out there in the world. But in many ways, it seems that it spreads as these sort of stories or rumors. How do you feel like, and these can both support trans equality and humanity and oppose them. So how did you see that sort of play out in your project?
I mean, I definitely think that you're right, that it is, like, nobody just like hears a fact and they're like, wow, that fact really transformed my worldview, right? Like, they heard that fact embedded in the narrative, and the narrative is what stuck with them. They'll get the number wrong, they'll get this, that, but like the impact of that narrative is particularly important. And when you look, for example, at a lot of the disinformation about trans rights that we see even in like the hallowed halls of policy production, where, you know, Congress had, I'm blanking on, I think it was I'm getting it wrong. There was a Senate committee hearing. I think the committee on the judiciary had like the due process implications of gender affirming care for youth. And it was a hearing in which they brought a bunch of anti-trans campaigners to give testimony that was full of disinformation about how dangerous providing transition-related care is. And it was important, as I suffered through this live stream, to notice that the vast majority of the claims that are being made are like personal experiences. It is a specific athlete talking about, and this is unfair that she has this, or they didn't say she, as though they should have, but said, well, she had this biological advantage and that's why I lost, and this is how it impacted me, and I lost this scholarship that I otherwise would have got. And like, that is what people are taking away. The disinformed claim at part of it of biological advantage, like, is a wrong fact, but that's not what mattered. And so by that same token, NCT storytellers in the training they got would frequently have little like webinar trainings where they're like, we're going to talk you through, this is what the policy says, and this is what's wrong about it, and these are the points you should hit on. But that was like the 10-minute beginning overview, and then they spent 50 talking about, let's workshop the way you express your personal narrative, your experience of the political issue, because that's what is expected of a testimony, right? Or that's what a journalist wants to encapsulate this news story as, is like what it's going to mean for you. And so like the facts do matter, sure, but like on both sides, it is a war of narrative, and who can craft the narrative that has the greatest degree of resonance, that's going to circulate the widest, that's going to have the greatest kind of like ring of truth to the otherwise uninformed audience.
That's great. All right, we have some time to open up for questions from the audience.
There's a question on the Zoom.
Great.
This person says, it seems that hate groups have become very good at taking away the phrases we use to help provide context around injustice by twisting the phrases to either sow confusion about their meaning or to serve their own ends. Phrases like fake news, Me Too, won't be erased, stay woke, Black Lives Matter. Can the politics of flows approach help us reclaim the language of justice?
Quite a question.
That's very good.
Yeah.
My answer is impressionistically. I won't claim to have verifiable truth on this answer. I think that there obviously is like a language war that happens, and you can see it with the kind of resignification of what woke means and the way that that's been mobilized for a variety of things, whether that's initially a war on critical race theory, which apparently we're now teaching legal theories to kindergartners, like they are so advanced.
Yeah.
Or the kind of more general like anti-DEI initiatives and all of those kinds of things. Like that is a war over language, and that resignification matters, but trying to wrest control of that word back is not going to do much, right? I think what the difficulty is it feels as though there needs to be a neat, concise encapsulation of what you're trying to say in a way that will be recognizably decoded with your intended kind of valence. But I think the problem in investing too much in that approach to communicating these complex ideas is it does leave them so open to resignification, where they do become more of a cultural signifier of your political alignment more than they are an expression of the content of your political sentiment. And so I think we shouldn't be overly invested in language reclamation or things like that. Because at that point, we're like fighting the wrong battle. Like, is it one that we're losing? Sure, but like, is it the war we wanted to be fighting in the first place? No. And I think one of the things that was really commonly discussed at NCTE was like, how do we resist what the administration and what various states are actually doing that is damaging, but without ceding control over what we think the agenda should be and letting the agenda just be fighting over what they want? How do we do this in a way that we do resist that and not cede that ground, but actually be able to set our own articulations of what it is trans equality looks like and what it is that we need to achieve? And that becomes very difficult when you do constantly need to be on the back foot. It's hard to be reactive and proactive at the same time. Like,
Yeah.
staff frequently would quip like, there are two speeds in the organization, immediately and eventually. And eventually never happens because you're constantly dealing with immediately.
Like
And
my inbox.
yeah, it was very, applies across a wide breadth of subjects. But yeah, I mean, that was one of the things that was difficult for them as an organization to have priorities is if you're constantly dealing with the immediacy of a fire, you can never deal with the eventually of achieving your vision for, you know, trans people's rights in the country.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a difficulty for a lot of progressive organizations, right? Because there's the sense that you're always on the defensive and you can't sit down and really like thoughtfully craft messaging policy.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah. Dr. McGregor.
Thank you so much. One of the questions that I have is like, I think that, both of, the cases that you mentioned here, but also in other places in the book show the importance of like this embodied and experienced identity, right? So these like community storytellers, right? Which I think is a feature of this, but also of many campaigns, right? That we see whether, political or aligned with particular issues or identities. But I'm wondering if you can discuss like the challenges of that and like how did the organization, for example, in this case, support the exposure that these, community storytellers were opening themselves up to as well and sort of engaging in this activism?
Yes, so that is a great question. It was harder for the organization to help a lot of the trans adults who were part of VTE, because for a lot of them, working with NCT was part of their advocacy, but they were also doing a lot on their own of their own initiative that was quite separate. And so oftentimes it felt a little bit more like, you're coming back to the resource pile to grab more resources, but not necessarily, they didn't necessarily have as actively managed of a day-to-day relationship with, how they went through things. They would work with people and like, here's what you can do with your social media. And a lot of times they would give them help where they're like, if you ever have a journalist contact you directly, you send us their contact information, we'll do the digging to figure out if it's someone you want to work with. If you have an interview scheduled, we'll help you prepare for it. But like there wasn't necessarily as much support. Whereas the FTE network, which was the Families for Trans Equality, so largely parents, usually moms of trans youth, they had like an active secret Facebook community, and there were two family organizers of the organization who did do a lot of very active work of like helping them navigate the specificities of their cases. And one of the women who was one of the family organizers, herself the mother of Avery Jackson, who's the trans girl who was on the cover of National Geographic's issue on gender in modern society. Jackson is not their last name. But there were a lot of different details of their life, like they publicly worked under a pseudonym, they had been doxxed previously, and they had taken a bunch of precautions moving forward. And so like we had on-staff experts who had like dealt with this in their own life. But like there were people who would say at a certain point, they're like, I can't do this, contact me in 6 months, but like I can't. And staff felt it themselves, the constant burnout. And in fact, the time that I was there were a lot of staff tensions over just like, this is constant, it is 60 hours a week, and it's my life and my work, and like that kind of falling apart was happening on a regular basis, for sure.
I'm sure it was very high paid.
You know, it was not. It was not, and I haven't written about this, maybe I will at some point somewhere. There's a lot to the labor politics of movements
Yeah.
that makes movements unsustainable. So shortly after I left the field, the organization kind of fell apart. There had been, staff had been going through the process of unionizing while I was in the field. And the upper leadership of the organization entirely mismanaged that process. And it ended up in basically all but like 4 members of the staff leaving the organization. And then the pandemic hit, and then all kinds of things have happened. So now actually as of a month ago, the organization no longer exists because it merged with another trans rights organization and rebranded as a new entity. But there was so much to go on inside the organization that was about, like, we are people who are earning paychecks and have to do work, and like work that is mission driven never gets the boundary put on it that would be put on any other job. And I think so much of movement success and failure does ironically come down to things that are invisible to the outside world, which are the labor conditions of these organizations as organizations.
Question in the back.
Thanks to Daniel Priest's generosity and connections, I was able to be at the 2016 Democratic Convention and attend the caucus, the Trans Caucus, which was the first time. Because you can imagine there were a lot of baby boomer age feminist women also at that caucus. Some of them now I realize would be called Turks. And how do you message? Trying to stress geographic and social similarity isn't going to work.
Yeah.
Well, you have women who identify as feminists who are anti-trans women arguing they're not women.
Yeah.
What's your messaging strategy?
Yeah, I mean, if I had a good one, I think I would be, I would.
The employee.
Yeah, I would.
Be running it.
Yeah, I mean, there's not like a good message. I think that in particular, what is subjectively at threat for cis women who are anti-trans is ownership over the category of womanhood. And so it fundamentally requires a redeveloped understanding of what is womanhood, where is it that we locate my own identity within that category, and where is it that we kind of articulate the particular structural positions of the woman in society, and certain definitions of that accommodate trans inclusion more than others. And so the difficulty is that the issue is fundamentally ideological. If your concept of womanhood is so firmly established, as it would be for someone who publicly espouses a feminist politics, then it is a lot of work that cannot just be messaged. There is more that needs to happen to that restructuring. And I think, you know, Sophie Lewis is a British trans feminist who had this really good quote in this New York Times piece about why there are so many fewer TERFs in the US than in the UK. And it has in large part, according to her, to do with the fact that British feminists haven't received the pummeling, as she put it, by Black and Indigenous feminists that American feminists have. For all of the other racial issues with American feminism, there's a certain degree of, what's the word to say, there's a different lens on gender that is less biologically essentialist, that is more informed in particular by Black feminist critiques of the ways that gender is constructed in ways that do deliberately degender and engender different people. And so I think that part of like my next project, as I kind of add the UK into this already chaotic mix, is doing work about the relationship between like ideology and persuasion, because you don't get persuaded out of ideology in the same way that you might be persuaded into a policy opinion. And so we're kind of operating at a different like structure of change making.
Other questions? Dr. Karpoli. This is great. Thank you so much. You were kind of getting to it in your last response. But during your talk, I think so much about Jen Schrade's The Revolution That Was.
Mhm.
You're documenting the revolution that was. And you were teasing out very clear things to me, at least about why what she was documenting is different than what you did. Did you, I mean, first, I don't know if you're familiar with that. I feel like you
Yes,
would be.
yes.
But could you talk a little bit more about where you saw as like the central reasons why? I mean, clearly had the narrative formation, the use of the multimedia environment, but she had so much about money.
Yeah.
Labor.
Yeah.
And so I just love a little bit more on that.
Can you give some context to the other audience members who may not have read the Jen Schrade's
Hasn't
book?
everybody read that one? Okay, no, sorry. So The Revolution That Wasn't is this book studied by a sociologist, Jen Schrade, who looks at organizing from conservative organizing and progressive organizing groups, and largely
In North
finds
Carolina.
in North Carolina and throughout, but a lot of it in the state, North Carolina, and finds that conservative groups are able to organize a lot better around keeping things the same rather than changing things or making progress or different changes, largely because they are better funded. So they have more time and more money.
Yeah.
And so you were getting at that so beautifully. And I
Yes.
would just love the opportunity to talk a little bit more about that.
I mean, one of the biggest issues in the trans movement is also like numbers, and not just the numbers of trans people, which is also an obvious issue, but like the number of organizations. NCT was at the time the only transgender rights organization that truly functioned at an entirely national level. There's a Transgender Law Center that primarily provided direct legal services in California, and the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund that primarily focused on litigation in New York, and then the Sylvia Rivera Law Project that primarily worked with low-income trans people of color in basically like trying to help them with court cases that involved like unnecessary carcerality. And so NCT was like the only like policy organization, national representation of the movement. That meant if there was work that needed to be done, it was being done by those 23 people. And so that meant that, you know, a part of the fact that the storyteller reliance on dealing with issues across the country was a scope thing. It was like, we can't put out the fires all across the country by ourselves. We need to be delegating this work out, but there aren't like a ton of local groups doing it. And so part of why NCTE and the trans movement in general was able to have some significant successes was because of their complicated relationship with the broader LGBTQ+ movement. And I write about this in the second chapter of the book, where there's a contentious relationship there that is sometimes collaborative, sometimes competitive, but they were able to successfully marshal the resources of larger organizations like HRC and other organizations at times in ways that were able to expand their influence. And more importantly, they did a lot of work to deliberately make sure that they had connections to other movements that weren't the LGBTQ+ movement. And so they had particularly tight relationships with the reproductive rights movement located in DC, and also with the ACLU. They had a quite strong relationship. And in fact, when NCT kind of collapsed, several NCT staff members then went to the ACLU to take that trans programming there. And so a lot of that was the clever marshaling of other people's resources, because NCT was not pulling in money the way others were. I also think that there was a lot of benefit that was gained from the fact that NCT was located in DC, and a lot of the organizations that they were kind of proxy warring with were not. And it's part of why NCT was deliberately placed in DC, is that geography and proximity to the centers of power. And so organizations like the ADF, for example, didn't function the same way and had different relationships to local politics. And a lot of their networks were more kind of like quote unquote submerged networks that were rooted throughout like churches and things like that, that provided them a really stable national infrastructure, but not necessarily like centralized organizing capacity.
We have a
Another Zoom
We're
question.
gonna take one more question
Okay.
and then we are gonna wrap it up.
Okay.
Yeah, we got it.
You want to do the Zoom?
Yeah.
question at the end?
Let's do Zoom.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does this recontextualization of the relationship between old and new media provide us with any insight on how these media activist dynamics might change in the short term with younger generations? Or does this interplay seem to be something that's resistant to change on that level?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think like my answer is a little bit that I ended up taking this like metaphor out of the book, but I think like there's like a misunderstanding of like where mass media and local media, for example, continue to fit in the media ecosystems of people who do consume primarily through digital media. And the metaphor I used was of the news feed for whatever your digital media app is. Like one of my favorite things that which people do is, why is nobody talking about X, as they link to a CBS article about X? And it's like, your media diet maybe does not, but you are also, you did get information about it and you're posting about it and other people are seeing it. And the scrolling through the newsfeed, that kind of contextual collapse, you don't always know when what you're consuming is local to you or is local to someone else and left its orbit, but found its way to you because of the various curation mechanisms of algorithms and your friend networks and whatever. But like, if you're scrolling through, any collection of 5 posts will include the New York Times, a random person who you don't know expressing a personal opinion in a local news story. And so I don't know that those dynamics are changing. I think the interface through which we get them is changing. I'm not independently going to the New York Times and to the Charlotte Observer and to my friend Karen. I'm getting all of them at the same time. And so sometimes that process like invisibilizes to us exactly the composition of the media diet that we have. And so I don't think that that is necessarily fully transforming. I think there are some differences if we were to be platform specific and look at TikTok. It's like, yeah, like the New York Times is probably not showing up on your For You page the way it would on Twitter, but you're also scrolling through a bunch of activists who are putting up screenshots of news articles behind them as they talk about their opinion on what's going on in Gaza. And so I don't necessarily think that this is going to change because of platforms. I think the greatest threat to them is the institutional collapse of journalism as an industry in terms of what it is will be being produced.
Yeah.
But I'm not concerned about what will be distributed.
All right, please join me in thanking TJ Billard.
Quick reminder, if you would like CLE credit, which is fantastic, on the back as you're leaving, there's going to be a few pieces of paper with the QR code. You can scan, check in, and get credit for this attendance. We also would love you to take copies of TJ's book. I would personally very much love if you take copies of the bookmark. I designed it. It was great. I'm very happy. So yeah, thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.